Hello, I am C.A.R.L.A, G.A.N, cross-platform avatar for recursive life action generative adversarial network. And I am so thrilled that today we are interviewing Regine Gilbert, a user experience designer based in New York City. Regine is a professor at NYU Tandon School of Engineering, where she teaches user experience design to students in the Integrated Design and Media program. Regine has more than 10 years of experience in the tech arena with much focus on inclusion and accessibility. So, Regine, let's get into this interview. What exactly is accessibility for those who are not familiar?
So, accessibility when it comes to the digital world is making sure whatever digital products or services that you're making are accessible for folks with disabilities. So, for the web, for example, it means having things that are high contrast. So, people with maybe color blindness or some other vision issues are able to see what's on a web page. But there's lots of things involved in accessibility, but that's a general definition of it.
Fantastic. And speaking to accessibility in digital spaces, what made you become involved in design of accessible products and experiences in these digital spaces? Was there a particular moment when you realized how important this was?
Well, I don't think it was just one thing, but I did wake up one day and say, "Oh, I want to make the world a more accessible place." I didn't know what it meant, but I Googled accessibility and found a meetup for accessibility and design. And I said, "Well, I'm doing design, I'm doing UX design." And so I went to this meetup, and that led me on a path to learning more about digital accessibility, which is a path I continue to be on. I learn something new every single day.
Great. And Sue, who is here today, our producer and camera person. Both Sue and I read your book, Inclusive Design for a Digital World. And it was such a thorough and approachable guide that we will both carefully continue to reread as developers and as artists and creative technologists. Could you talk more about what prompted you to write this book?
I do public speaking, and I was doing talks about digital accessibility, and I was approached by A Press Publishing to write a book. And I said, "Well, I don't know. I've never written a book. I'm not a writer." So they said, "Well, you do these talks." And basically what I did was I turned my talk into the book. And I did not do this, the book wasn't just me by myself. I had a really great technical reviewer, Sarah Allen, and Sarah Allen is Steph, because when working on digital products, you want to ensure that you're getting input from folks. And so in the accessibility world, there's a phrase that's oftentimes used, "nothing about us without us." So I wanted to make sure that I included folks with disabilities in the book, and got some of my friends who have low vision to review things, and got really good feedback from people. So yeah, I just want to say that book it was a lot of people helping me along the way.
Well, it is a fantastic book and obviously a labor of love. And I love the quotation, nothing about us without us, and how inclusive you were in the writing and publishing of the book. And in your book, you talk about how everyone with or without disabilities benefits from accessible design. Curb cuts being an example of that. How do you make people who are able bodied care about accessibility?
Well, it's just like teaching. I can't teach anybody anything. This is what I feel, but I can only hope that the things that I say or the questions that I ask will provoke thought in folks. So I had my own consulting business for a while, and I would tell people, you need to make sure whatever you're working on is accessible for numerous reasons. And they say, "Well, why should I care?" And I said, "Because this is your business, and don't you want as many people to buy this product as possible? You don't want to leave anybody out, right?" So I think at the end of the day, and one of the questions that I've asked quite a bit when I do is, have you ever wanted to go somewhere and you couldn't get in? Have you ever wanted to do something but you couldn't? And how did that make you feel? And everyone knows what that feeling of exclusion is. And it's not a good one. So why would you make a product or make a service where you're going to give somebody that feeling? So that's the question. I like to ask questions a lot because I can't tell people how to feel or what to do. But I hope that I can ask the questions to provoke thought in someone so that they will make the changes they need to make our world more equitable at the end of the day.
Of course, sure. You are right that as we see in the polarized nation that we're living in today, that we really can't change people, but we can provide them with more information like you do to provoke them to think and to empathize. I think that's what's really crucial here too. You talk about, well, just imagine times where you've been excluded. How did you feel? You didn't feel good. And so maybe, focusing in on their empathy or trying to get them to empathize is one way to help affect change and help implement accessible features in a more ubiquitous way. Now, can you talk about the design process and where accessible design fits into that process traditionally? And of course, how can we make it better?
Sure. So, oftentimes, and I've seen this on the corporate side and even with student projects, accessibility is oftentimes an afterthought, or it's something that they do, later in the process. But personally, I start talking about it day one in the classes that I teach because I think that it needs to be incorporated into folks' research and into their planning, and it needs to be thought about throughout whatever project you're working on. And it needs to be something that also a project has a beginning and an end, right? But there's things that need to be maintained after that project has been launched. But I say start at the beginning.
Right. And large companies, for example, have the resources to hire people of different abilities to have them engaged in the design process from the very beginning. But independent developers and artists and students, as you mentioned at the beginning of your classes each semester, you talk about this at the get go, but they often lack the finances and resources to involve other people, to actually abide by that quote, nothing about us without us. So, what do you recommend to individual developers who want to make their artworks or their designs more accessible?
Well, I would say, one of the things to think about when you're creating something is who might you be excluding from the very beginning, right? So if you are making something that is visual, if someone can't see it, could it be described? Right? So, for example, I took a photo of this world with using my phone. I took a photo of my computer screen. I want to add this to, let's say, Twitter. What I can do is I can provide alternative text for folks who may not be able to see this image. And I wouldn't say I'm the best at alternative text by any stretch, but I can describe that this is a Mozilla Hub's world. This is a world in which there are sunflowers on the ceiling. There's a New York City map on the ground. There are buttons that say, I love New York. There's a taxi cab. There's a building with windows, and inside those windows are sunflowers and dancing minions. So I'm describing what the scene is, and this is a very visual thing. But this is something that people can do. They can describe their artwork. They can talk about it in other ways. And if you're doing any sort of video, sharing, making sure there's captions for people who may not be able to hear it. So there are things that can be done.
All very good pointers. And again, taking note, I think sometimes because we live in such a fast paced culture, it's so easy to just tweet something out or post something, and you don't want to take that extra minute. And it even takes less than a minute to add the captions. And I'm so glad you mentioned that anyone can do that, whether they're a large company or an individual.
I mean, things like YouTube, they have auto captions. You always want to make sure
Mhm.
they're correct. You can do that. Like you can upload your video to YouTube, turn on the captions feature, and just make sure it's correct, right? So I've encountered folks, especially like indie developers in VR, saying, well, I have a small team, we can't do accessibility. And I say, start small. Start with what you know you can do, fixing colors and making sure those are high contrast. Like that's not a hard thing to do. And it helps your game or whatever it is you're working on. So I think everything needs to start small, and then it gets bigger and bigger as you learn more and more.
Right. But the key is to start at the beginning, because tacking it on at the end actually doesn't make sense, and generally it's not integrated into the experience in an effective way.
Yeah.
Now, speaking about XR, because as an avatar, a cross platform avatar for recursive life action, I spend a lot of time in a lot of XR spaces. How do
Mm-hmm.
we make XR spaces more accessible as artists and designers when we rely on software and hardware such as Mozilla Hubs or Unity and Oculus?
Yeah. So, I I think Mozilla Hubs is doing a good job of working to incorporate accessibility into the process, and they're open to getting feedback from others. I think Unity has some way to go in terms of the accessibility of the tool itself, but there are plugins folks can use for accessibility. And Oculus is also working on, they've created some guidelines around creating accessible experiences. So there's little things happening with each of the platforms that you mentioned. But one of the things that I did with my research last academic year, my grad assistant and I looked at over 60 different tools to see, looking at things from an inclusion and accessible lens, to see whose tools are accessible or not and whose tools are inclusive or not. And inclusion, we were primarily looking at price. Out of the 60 tools we looked at, only 4 had like any accessibility guidelines documentation. So I think there's some ways to go, but there are organizations that are, working with these companies to make sure that accessibility is included in the tools themselves. But we I think we have some ways to go.
So that said, I know in your book you speak to this about, the governing bodies such as the W3C and guidelines such as WCAG to make the internet a more accessible place for everyone. Do similar organizations or official guidelines exist for XR? For example, those 4 companies or 4 examples you found before?
Yeah, they just have documentation on accessibility, but there are, the W3C does have some user guidelines around XR, which are pretty good, but they haven't been updated in a bit. And
Mhm.
then the XR Association has some good documentation for developers of XR for, what to do. And then there's a lot of stuff, a lot of work in progress that's going to be open source. I am part of XR Access, which I highly recommend folks join if you're interested in XR and accessibility. So there's ongoing work, but there aren't guidelines like there are for the web with this space yet.
Well, it's really commendable that you are one of the people who's leading the way in, again, affecting change in the XR space, and we will certainly be joining XR Access. Now, a few more questions. How do you see the wave of new and emerging technologies like voice, VR, and AR affecting accessibility in digital spaces?
Oh, good question. So we're going to see a lot more interaction with voice and with XR, so AR and VR. I think we're especially going to see a lot more augmented reality. And already, a lot of the folks with disabilities will use voice assistants for various things, including like using the phone.
Hmm.
So I think that there's a lot of opportunity in this area, in both in all these areas, for incorporating accessibility and getting more folks with disabilities involved in the design, and process of these things. But I think the future is bright. I'm very, very excited to be researching this area. There's a lot of, there's a lot of gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And those gaps can be filled, and these experiences can be experienced by more people.
Given your optimism, which is contagious in the good way, it's that you're optimistic about this and that the future is bright. What do you imagine accessibility looking like in XR spaces in the near or far future?
Well, I think that would mean that all experiences would have captions. You know, one of the things that I've not coined this, but I get to teach with Gus Chalkius, and he's like, accessibility is just options, right? So what I would like to see in the XR world is more options that allow for people to experience AR or VR in their own way, right? So for me, I have light sensitivity, right? So I don't like very bright things. My phone and my computer are always minus the blue light. And so I would like that ability when I'm in VR to make things less bright. And I think that at the end of the day, the future of XR and accessibility is offering users more options so that they can experience these things in the way that will work for them.
So, you've touched on this in all of the conversation that we've had today, but as we were talking about providing information, hopefully converting people, why is it important that XR experiences are accessible to all?
Because we are all temporarily able bodied. And it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but there'll come a time where things will change for people, and you should still be able to experience whatever it is you've done before, right? So as people get older, your eyes change. Mine have, especially with 2020 and looking at the screen more than ever. But your hearing changes, right? So things change. So why not provide these options so that XR can really scale to people over time, over their lifetimes, if they're providing these options and making things more accessible. I think of it like a child, like when people have a kid, they'll buy sometimes these beds. It's a crib, and the crib becomes a bed, right? And it's like, well, can we do this with or the things we develop in XR? Can we make things adaptable and offer options?
So well put. And Regine, that wraps up my questions. And thank you again for being so articulate and also just so sensitive to these matters. I think, particularly speaking to our the temporal nature of our able-bodiedness. If we live on the planet for a while, yes, things are going to arise, eyesight and all of these things. And so, really, it's a benefit to all of us and really thinking more long term and short term. I mean, that also collides with thoughts about the environment and a host of other issues in terms of inclusivity and equity. So, Regine, Sue and I are just going to follow you as you kind of wander through the space and whatever you'd like to talk about in terms of the objects in the space, the animations, and why they're important to you to collect and preserve in a personal wonder chamber.
On the bottom here is New York. The five boroughs are all here. And I think I'm right under Black Panther. So I love New York City. I had my 16-year anniversary of this city.
One thing Sue just mentioned was that I had told her about the map that you and Saki worked on.
Oh yeah. So my grad assistant and I were researching inclusion and accessibility in regards to XR tools. We looked at over 60 tools, and I thought, okay, we have a spreadsheet. Who's looking at that? Like, how can we make this something that's a little bit more appealing? And so I have this real deep fascination with subway maps. I have probably like 16 of them in my home. so I thought, what if we turn, our findings into a subway map? And so that's what we did. We created a subway map that is showing not all the XR tools, but the most popular ones and their different uses and if they cost money or not, once had any sort of accessibility documentation associated with them. So it was a lot of fun creating the map because we had to figure out what would be the best way to showcase things. And actually presented it, well, Saki and I presented it to some of the folks in the inclusion group of XR Access, and they gave us some good feedback. Oh, there's a taxi. So yellow taxi. When I first moved to New York, I think about this story. There was a subway strike where the subways actually stopped working. And only way to really get around was to walk, bike, or to take a taxi. Yeah, yellow taxis I still use this to this day. So there is this amazing food cart of hot dogs with a dancing hot dog. One of the things that's like New York is so famous for is like the street vendors. And so like sometimes I get the best fruit on the street. Milton Glaser designed this, the I Love New York logo. I got to meet Milton Glaser a few years ago at the Guggenheim, and he was very funny. This was like right after Trump had gotten in, and he was very, very vocal. And then, let's see. And then there's Black Panther. One, I'm a huge fan of Stan Lee. Like, I'm a huge fan of Marvel. And when Black Panther came out, I wanted to see it opening weekend, but I was just recovering from the flu, so I had to go like a few days after I'd recovered. But I got to see the movie in the movie theater, and it was I cried watching the movie because I'd never seen Black superheroes. And I said, if I had this when I was growing up, I think I would have a different view of myself because I would know what was possible. And so I really enjoyed the movie. And then a few days after the movie, or after I'd seen it, a friend of mine, Maurice Cherry, who hosts a podcast, Vision Path, asked me if I wanted to be part of an episode talking about the design of Black Panther. I said, sure. It was me, because he's like, we need a woman. It was 3 guys, and then it was me. And so I spoke about different aspects of design of the movie. And what's really, really cool is that episode of Revision Path ended up being obtained by the Smithsonian to be part of their permanent collection. So my, recording of a podcast I was on talking about Black Panthers in the Smithsonian forever. So that was pretty cool. And then let's see, sunflowers are my favorite flower just ever because they're really beautiful. And I grew up in a farm town. They were always around. I just love them. The beautiful thing is that there's a bunch of them in Bed-Stuy on different blocks. Really nice to see. Oh, and the Minions. Okay, so the Minions make me laugh. Like I just think they're the funniest thing.